So hi everyone and welcome to this book launch event. We are very happy to host it and I welcome you on behalf of the Romani Studies program. I am Márton Rövid, I'm a visiting professor at the program. Most of you know us. Thank you for joining us in Vienna and in Budapest. But in a nutshell, we have a preparatory program in Budapest and we offer graduate courses in Vienna and an advanced certificate also in Romani Studies. And we are very happy to present a very important volume today, which has the title, The Political Economy of Extreme Poverty in Eastern Europe, a comparative historical perspective of Romanian Roma. The book has four editors, Enikő Vincze, Soringog, and Mãrginean Friberg. We have Enikő today with us, and the book is published in the Routledge Contemporary Russian and Eastern European series. The book is open access, so hopefully many of you had already a chance to take a look at it and to read the book. And today we would have a very simple book launch event where Enikő is presenting the book itself, and we have two chapter authors. So Enikő Vincze is a professor of sociology and urban studies at the Babes-Bolyai University in Romania. Her presentation will be followed by the presentation of Angéla Kóczé, who is an assistant professor and chair of the Romani studies here at CEU. And the last presenter is Mãrginean, a senior researcher at the George Bajracu Institute of History in Cluj-Napoca. So I would invite Enikő to present briefly the book, and then we will go into the presentations. And I will share your PowerPoint.
Yes, thank you. Okay. Very happy to be here. Thank you for the invitation and for making space and time to discuss on the margins of this book. So it will be a short discussion. The book has 9 chapters, and at the most what we can do today is to introduce it as a whole and also to speak on 3 of its chapters. So the book is based on a research project whose title was Precarious Labor and Peripheral Housing, the socio-economic practices of Romanian Roma in the context of changing industrial relations and territorial development. What was our approach in this research project was the aim to understand Roma poverty, and we should put this concept in quotes, as a historically manufactured reality and as a process, right, which is structured by political and economic mechanisms of political economy regimes. And actually what we were focusing on was mostly state socialism and neoliberal capitalist transformations in Romania. So we had, however, a larger longitudinal approach, focusing a bit, and you see one of our chapters, chapter 1, is actually making this longue durée historical analysis of Roma impoverishments through the slavery system, through the politics of Roma assimilation in Transylvania, and also the Second World War deportations of Roma. Okay, so this is a long durée perspective, and this longitudinal approach is continuing with a focus on industrialization during state socialism, and further on deindustrialization in post-socialist transition, and also the reindustrialization of the country, Romania, mostly after the accession of Romania to the EU and with the involvement of foreign direct investments. We also have a kind of spatial approach alongside this longitudinal approach, meaning that in our analysis we connect or we observe how the relation between rural and urban areas changed during these transformations. Also a spatial approach in terms of addressing national level legislation, policies, and also how this is reflected at local level in the city of Baia Mare and in Maramureș County, where we actually conducted our empirical research fieldwork. And also the spatial approach is about studying transnational migration. So you see actually that chapters 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 are focusing on and are using the materials collected in Romania, in Maramureș County, in particular in the city of Baia Mare. All these chapters are dealing with different aspects of socialist industrialization and post-socialist deindustrialization and later reindustrialization, focusing on labor relations, housing, and well, connected to all this, the reproduction of poverty and the deepening of impoverishment of the Roma from the city and from the whole county. Chapter 7 is a focus on migration of Roma abroad, which actually is part of the larger transnational migration processes, which started with the privatization and the industrialization process in Romania with the 1990s. And chapter number 8 is actually our Norwegian component, so to speak. We had a Norwegian partner, Fafo Institute from Oslo. They did interviews in Oslo with Roma street workers and also analyzed policies and wondering about why the Norwegian welfare regime couldn't integrate Roma who migrated from Romania due to economic reasons. And last but not least, chapter number 9, authored by Angéla. She gave a focus on Central and Eastern Europe, analyzing how different development projects and policy orientations, but also research on Roma contributed to the unfortunate association of the Roma with poverty. Okay, so in terms of methods, we conducted 200 interviews in Maramureș County with Roma and non-Roma inhabitants, but also with representatives of local and county public administration, but also of some new companies in Baia Mare mostly, because Baia Mare became a kind of manufacturing hub for European furniture chains of productions. In addition, we made archive research, not only our historian colleague Mara, who will present her chapter very soon, but also many of the research team used this historical perspective and used archive materials about industrial relations, housing, territorial development in the county and in the city. Okay, and also the study of national legislation and strategies in the domain of housing and Roma policies were also in our attention. So why is Romania an interesting case? It illustrates one of the biggest maybe paradoxes of capitalist transformations, but maybe this is not a paradox, maybe this is part of natural being of capitalism, which is that a country which was classified as a high-income country in 2019 by the World Bank has such high degree of poverty and concentration of income and housing poverty among the Roma. And why Baia Mare? Because we consider that it's a small city, small town in North Romania, actually reflects a case of overreach, economic and social developmental indicators. It was one of the most important industrial mining centers in the country, not only during socialism, but also prior to it. And now, as I said, as a part of reindustrialization is also a point in the new chains of production, capitalist change of production connected, for example, to IKEA, so the furniture company networks. Okay, so I guess it's enough about this general introduction. Thank you.
Thank you, Enikő. And Mara, would you be the next speaker? You can even share your screen if you want.
Hello, everyone. I don't have a PowerPoint, so I will just make some very brief remarks about my work in this project. I will start by saying something a little bit about myself. I'm a historian working on social implications of urbanization in post-World War II Romania. And prior to joining this project, I worked on several other industries across the country. And when I joined the project, I had this experience in different industries, steel industry, and also some light industry in Cluj, where I'm currently based. And I had a certain understanding of what industrialization is. And when I started doing research, I realized that one of the first things that I need to do is to, in fact, reconsider the process of the definition of industrialization. Because industrialization in Romania, as a socialist country, as it turned out, it was not a linear process. It was not a uniform process that occurred and unfolded similarly across the country. It also had lots of variations and local manifestations. And Baia Mare proved to be, and Maramureș in general, and Baia Mare proved to be quite an extraordinary opportunity from this point of view for me to, in fact, open up my perspectives on industrial growth and industrialization and social impact of various social categories and workers and so on. And this was a first challenge for me when I started doing research. And the second one is something that many of the researchers that look at Roma history in post-war Romania or during socialist period is that there aren't too many archival sources to document the fate of Roma. Mostly because Roma was not an official recognized minority by the socialist regime. And so even though they are mentioned in censuses, for instance, the state collected information about their demographic status. Other than that, we do not have a consistent recording of their experiences. Furthermore, if you try and do archival research, most of the time we find references to Roma only in negative contexts, which pretty much forces us to, or forces historians, or puts historian in a very, how should I say, problematic position of constructing a narrative that might not be necessarily fully relevant to the experience of Roma. And to talk about my chapter in this volume, There is a quite important references in the existing scholarship on the Roma that revolve around a historical moment in 1977. It was a teleconference set up by the country's leadership with several representatives of various central and local decision-making factors. And this teleconference aimed to address the socio-economic conditions of the Roma in Romania. And in his address, Ceausescu highlighted several aspects related to Roma's living conditions, unhygienic living conditions, their houses that were mostly constructed for cardboard. Also, he emphasized the general low level of education among the Roman population, expressing concerns about limited prospects for the improvement in the near future. Also, high incidence of social diseases such as tuberculosis or parasitic infestations. Equally troubling was the fact that many Roma individuals were unwilling, or they claimed that were unwilling to pursue gainful employment that was beneficial to society, and instead chose to beg and relocate from one region to another. And despite this conspicuous evidence of profound poverty within the Roma community, most of the researchers have attributed Ceausescu's intervention primarily to the outcome of the 1977 census. What really happened is that it was published during the summer. It was the data were collected in the spring of 1977. It was published during the summer. And what it showed is that it revealed a number of 227,000 Roma that resided in Romania. But what really was problematic apparently was that this number was 4 times higher than the numbers that were documented by the census conducted 10 years later in 1966. And so many of the researchers, much of the scholarship that exists, has kind of placed this data, this census data, at the core of Ceausescu's intervention and a set of politics that aimed to integrate the Roma and to force their integration into the communities. The problem is that this prevailing scholarship views seems to be shaped primarily by the limited availability of sources, and also by the predominant anti-communist historiographic narrative that still dominates the Romanian historiography. And although such contributions serve a valuable purpose in documenting the top-down policies of the socialist state toward the Roma and explaining the institutional mechanisms of central and local control authorities, preference for political central approaches in analyzing social realities can lead to an account that is detached from the multitude of economic and social changes that fundamentally transformed Romania in the 1960s and 1970s. And so, since it is statistically impossible, and this was one of the things that I constantly took into consideration when doing the research for this project, since it is statistically impossible for a population of a particular group, of ethnic group or so on, to almost quadruple within a decade, I started to wonder what exactly led to the Roma gaining greater visibility in the perception of the socialist state. Was this increase solely due to improved methods of collecting and interpreting statistical data compared to previous censuses? Or was it the direct result of some complicated social and economic restructuring processes within Romanian society from the late 1960s onwards, which finally revealed the growing wealth gap between a relatively affluent majority of population and Roma communities trapped in extreme poverty? And so from my contribution, I considered these questions. And rather than delivering a narrative that deals exclusively with various aspects of Roma precarity in the city, my chapter attempts to situate the Roma's everyday experience within the broader framework of social and economic functional logic of the socialist state. And this angle is particularly important because we already know from a wealth of social science research that was conducted in Romania in the 1970s that the level of or the rhythm or the momentum of social mobility drastically decreased by the 1970s. So the capacity of the socialist state to support social mobility was in fact admitted to be diminishing by the 1970s. And in doing this, I kind of moved my perspective from an and I started to understand and to place the experience of the Roma population and to put them in a broader conversation about issues of industrialization and the type of industrialization that was specific to Baia Mare in the 1970s and 1980s. I premised that in the late 1960s and early 70s, when growth policies were being reconsidered because of the erosion of industrial paradigm worldwide, the Bucharest authorities embarked on an ambitious economic project to narrow the development gap with the more advanced Western states. Self-identified as a developing country, Romania imagined its path out of backwardness as a paradoxical encounter among the consolidation of traditional industries, mining, steel, and petrochemistry, and the intensive extraction of natural resources. By the late 1960s, the regime had already embraced the idea that enhancing its growth project required access to significant amounts of natural resources that would provide local industries with the necessary inexpensive raw materials. In the long run, it was expecting that as the level of development increased, the need for natural resources would diminish. In the short term, this idea meant that the Romanian authorities would spare no effort to secure access to as many resources as possible, even if this meant extensive exploitation of the existing natural resources up to the degree of complete subsoil depletion. The problem is, or the idea is that this is what really happened in Baia Mare. We have a certain dormant exploitation of the copper resources in the 1950s and 1960s, and then an explosion of investment and interest by of the socialist state in these resources. Numerous central and local institutions were responsible for implementing this vision by drawing up and implementing economic plans, building partnership with international partners, promoting the exploitation of natural resources, and maintaining social balance within the population. However, the actions of the Romanian regime highlighted the heterogeneity of the socialist state. And so, particularly various types and practices of the local authorities, of local bureaucracy, in bargaining and in negotiating different aspects related to industrial labor, allocations of financial resources, and in securing and attracting labor force of particular skills. And while Weimar is, and this is why what I said, it's an ideal place to look at these issues, particularly because of the exceptionality of the 1970s in terms of industrialization and growth compared to the previous decades. And the significant reserves of non-ferrous metal concentrated in the mines near the town made this industrial center one of the most important points of the socialist authorities' development program. And as I show in my chapter, the intensification of exploitation after 1965 required an increase in the number of skilled workers by more than 30%, which pressured local authorities to meet the needs of the mine administrations for the required labor force, both by building housing in the city and by providing significant financial resources to create jobs for female workforce, particularly the wives of the workers that were hired in the mines. While this growing official interest in boosting copper and lead mining empowerment, mining empowered skilled workers and technical personnel and open up employment opportunities for women, it also contributed to the marginalization of social groups whose integration into the workforce was already hampered by the precarious education and skills, as is the case of Roma, who lived in poor, often unhealthy neighborhoods that were close to the city's industries. And so my chapter briefly discusses the reasons for the socialist state's turn to resource extraction and highlights the complicated circumstances that brought Weimar to the forefront of Romanian growth project in the 1960s, 1970s. And then explains the conditions that led to a series of adjustments in the labor market policies since the late 1960s, highlighting the key role of skills in the reorientation of labor solidarities, both within the mine and outside the mines. And this opened a wide space where Roma's unskillfulness became a powerful argument used by the local authorities in the reallocation of municipal facilities, such as quality houses, access to urban social infrastructure, and decent paying jobs. And I'll start here. I'll stop here and thank you.
Thank you, Mara, for this historical overview. And I suggest that we collect questions and comments after all three authors. So I would invite Angéla Kóczé to present her chapter, and I will share your PowerPoint as well.
Thank you so much. Thanks for coming this event. Is that okay? Okay. So actually, I was one of the researchers in the group who didn't go to the field work. So as you figured out, the work mainly was done by the Romanian researchers plus the Norwegian partners, because it was made under the Norwegian fund, right? And I've been invited as a scientific advisor with Viola Zentai, and later on I joined to the group, and my chapter is much more theoretical, as you recognize that as well. So I just would like to go through very quickly, and I know guys is 6, almost 15, so it's really hard to follow what we are talking about. So basically, what I wanted to give some kind of overview of Roma-related poverty research in Central Eastern Europe. So zoom out from Romania and to see what have been published and produced which relate to Roma poverty. And I wanted to examine the conceptual framework and the methodologies as well, which have been used, and to see that what kind of roles international organizations played role in shaping this kind of discourse, such as World Bank, UNDP, OSCE, Open Society Foundations, as you know it as well. And I argue that scholars such as Nancy Fraser have advanced our understanding of the ways in which neoliberal racial capitalism generates and reproduces inequalities, marginalization, and exclusion, thereby perpetually fostering and consolidating racialization. So she proposes an understanding that differs from the exploitation-centered conceptions of capitalism, which according to her cannot explain its persistent entanglement with racial oppression. This nuanced approach helps us decipher the reproduction of extreme poverty in the era of neoliberal capitalism, when Roma inclusion was high on the developmental agenda. In addition, this approach enables us to reveal that the dominant explanations for why most Roma people are poor and have been trapped in poverty for many generations reflect the broader political economic dynamics, relations, and ideologies that prevail at a particular historical juncture. I wanted to read this because I think that's very concise, actually, that I wanted to make a step further and to see the connection with the racial capitalism. And of course, Nancy Fraser connected with the Black Marxist and radical thinkers as well, as I'm writing about it in the article, and you will read it. And basically what she is telling to us that this kind of persistent entanglement with racial oppression was not really discussed in the framework of poverty-related researches. So therefore, I really wanted to cross-studies, cross-examine, and cross-read this kind of researches and studies through epistemological and methodological perspectives. And basically what I did as a theoretical conceptualization of poverty in Central Eastern Europe, I identified three types of, as a sociologist, always try to construct some kind of typology, culturalist, functionalist, and structuralist approach. What I related them to sociological and anthropological schools focusing on ideas, patterns, and explanatory frameworks that have explained the perennial and entrenched poverty of Roma in Central Eastern Europe. And as you see that I distinguished relative poverty, absolute poverty, and ultra poverty. And I would like to underline actually the third concept, ultra poverty, which is a kind of new concept, particularly relating to Romani studies and Roma poverty, which has been used in this very specific research project. And it's important because it's really focusing on extreme deprivation, so beyond traditional poverty measures. And the dimension of poverty, unidimensional, multidimensional, and of course intersectional factors as well, because I wanted to see that how gender has been articulated through this kind of studies. And so we have three major categories or conceptual framework influencing poverty research: cultural, behavior, and which basically states that poverty is a result of individual and cultural choices. And I was quite shocked that how it has been like recycled and repeated again and again without any kinds of reflection on that, where it's coming from. And the second one is the functional theories like poverty, which basically fulfills some kind of necessary role in our society, maintaining social stability. And it's very much called like a kind kind of, establishment sociology, which try to keep the status quo in place. And the third one, which is the structural theory and poverty results from macroeconomic and systemic forces. And I wanted to bring just a taste, like particularly from the cultural behavior theories, because I think that was one of the strongest, what I found even in a World Bank or UNDP's discourse as well. So cultural behavior theories explain the cause of poverty as a cultural and behavior, the latter of which is more scientifically acceptable. According to behavior theories, poor people are trapped in poverty because they engage in counterproductive behavior or risk, such as single motherhood, unemployment, or any other social deviancy, which significantly increases the likelihood of poverty. So according to this literature trope, poverty is high and dense in a context where people are engaged in problematic behavior. Furthermore, this approach implies that poverty is reproduced by the mechanisms of risky and deviant behaviors that are disproportionately prevalent among racialized minorities. In addition, this type of study suggests that we need to change these people, reducing their risky and deviant behaviors and activities to reduce poverty. And I wanted to read out this because I think it's such a strong discourse which have been, used and re-articulated by neoliberal discourses as well, and always like changing the people, changing their attitude, changing because they are doing some deviant stuff. However, they never really take into account the structural forces which shapes their life. And quoting McLenaham, who argues, to break the intergenerational cycle of poverty, we will need to find a way to persuade young women from disadvantaged backgrounds that delaying fertility while they search for a suitable partner will have a payoff that is large enough to offset the loss of time spent as mother, or the possibility of foregoing motherhood entirely. So this very much implies that changing young, disadvantaged women's behavior and cultural values will improve their social and economic status. I think that was like really a strong line which came through in so many documents. And later on, I'm talking about the World Bank reports and OSCE, not the OSCE, UNDP. And basically, these reports are also talking about that how Roma are trapped in poverty and welfare dependency. So basically that they are dependent on welfare. Therefore, we have to do something with them, right? Because that's a wrong behavior and they have to get out of that. And any kinds of, like lack of critical interrogation of the market transition to capitalism, deindustrialization, structural empowerment, or any other related effects that accelerated the precarious situation of the vast majority of Roma after 1989 have led to a non-comprehensive understanding of social exclusion. For example, analyzing the report, The Roma in an Expanding Europe, Breaking the Poverty Cycle, and I'm not going to read that, but I just wanted to give a taste that how strong is this kind of cultural behavior theories, and many of these tropes, of course, some of you already studied the Oscar Lewis, right? Anthropologies, the culture of poverty, are relying on that, and it still influences Roma-related studies. And basically, what I indicated in the PPT as well, that Roma most of the time portrayed as trapped in generational poverty due to cultural deficiencies, right? And the functionalist theories, social, what I already talked about it, and you can read it as well, but it's very much about, you know, social stratification, which really ensure social stability, and this is okay. And I'm mentioning key scholars, and in a Roma-specific context. So basically, Roma economic marginalization is seen as a natural thing. So it's a natural and necessary for labor market. And some studies argue that Roma poverty sustains the market-driven economy. So we need that. So there is a function of it. And the last one is the structuralist theories. I'm not going to go through on that, because I guess the time is running, but you can read in the chapter. And one of the most interesting, actually, discussions and debate which came up, and I went through again this underclass debate, so which is very, very interesting, and it was really interesting to read again Ladany and Szelenyi, that basically they wanted to explain the racialization of Roma with the underclass concept and structural racism, not cultural traits, and create poverty. So, and in that time, they've been under attack or criticized by many scholars, and it was really interesting to see the dynamics. So international organizations approaches, you can read it in the chapter. And one of the critiques, actually, that they are always overemphasize the market solution. So market is going to solve our problem. This trickle-down effects that you know, it will reach the most marginalized and the most excluded people as well, right? But that's not really happened, and certainly I'm talking about the failures to address the systemic discrimination and racial exclusion as well. And also I'm writing about this kind of neoliberal paradox, which is on one hand offering the market-based solution, the self-empowerment, everybody are free to do and equal, and that's really great. But on the other hand, Roma portrayed as a undeserving people who are living on the welfare support, right? So they are distinguishing the deserve for people who are deserving support, and the other group of people who are undeserving support. And the impact of neoliberalism, what I'm talking about it as well, is basically reduced social investments for marginalized groups, including Roma. So many years of disinvestment certainly led to an extreme social exclusion and really deepened the racial and economic inequalities. Anyway, conclusion, but you will read it. So Roma poverty is not a cultural deficiency, certainly, but very much product of the racial capitalism. And so I'm calling for a holistic interventions a la Nancy Fraser, redistribution, recognition, and representation. And we really need a justice-centered policies, right? And I'm actually quoting Vincent Funk, who argues that we need a radical shift from general anti-poverty programs that functions as a charity paradigm, right? It's a project-based stuff. And quoting him, which centers on goodwill-based private and official donations to a justice paradigm where it is widely recognized that extreme poverty is a grave injustice in an affluent world and requires extensive institutional reforms, active civic participation, and possibility global wealth redistribution to be eradicated. So let's hope that, you know, future is going to be a little bit better. Thank you.
Thank you, Angela. And last but not least, I invite Enikő to present your chapter. Yeah, it is shared.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Angela, for your presentation, which actually reminds me that at the end of the PREC project, we together, I mean, Babesba University and CEU's Romani Studies Department organized a conference whose title was Racial Capitalism, and through the perspective of Roma studies. And we really were convinced, and we are still convinced, I guess, that Romani studies can have a contribution to global debates around racial capitalism. So hopefully we will make use of all those debates during the conference. Now I will zoom in again into our PREC work local investigation in Baia Mare, talking about how racialization and housing unevenness are related. And this is a chapter written by myself and two of my colleagues, Manel Mirianu and Georgia Iulian Zamfir, who were also part of the fieldwork. So our question was how these two processes and characteristics that we observe are interrelated. So racialization of the Roma people and racialized housing unevenness, and how this nexus is manifested in different political economy regimes, like in state socialism and capitalism. So in doing this investigation, we relied a lot on Michael Buravoy's practice of doing case study research, like, using a case to illustrate larger processes by making appeal not only to your empirical information, but also to theories, and actually to, with the help of those existing theories, to highlight how micro processes influence micro processes and vice versa. What we did in terms of empirical research was, while we started with walking around Baia Mare, so that was a kind of anthropological journey to discover housing arrangement in the city, and we discovered several areas which could be called marginalized urban areas, which were inhabited by Roma people mostly. And we started to make the interviews with those inhabitants from these territories, and then going back and forth to the city hall, and also interviewing former architects and city planners to learn about local housing policies and urban development, spatial development in Baia Mare before 1990 and after. And from these informal discussions and semi-structured interviews, we discovered a very interesting story of one of the areas of Baia Mare, and then we went to the archives to check about the formation of that area. So this is again a very dense scheme, but it's important for you at least to see the logic of the scheme, how we constructed our analysis on the basis of all these different materials that we collected by fieldwork. So we looked, and this is actually written in chapter 4 of the volume. we looked for the socialist period, which we could differentiate into two big phases. So starting with at the end of the Second World War during the till the 1960s, and the second phase 1970s and 1980s. We followed, the national legislation, and obviously we could observe those programs and strategies of the Romanian Communist Party regarding the Roma population. In the 50s, 60s, 70s, there were such reports published on the situation of Roma. And there we could figure out that the preoccupation of the leaders was actually focused on traveler Roma, semi-nomad Roma, who were not integrated or were not ready, as they said, to be integrated into socialist industries, becoming a labor force, becoming a worker, right? And that was actually the idea, to transform them into workers with all the benefits of these social status. They discovered and described by those times the housing situation of these semi-nomad Roma people, the issues of illiteracy, inadequate housing and sanitary conditions, and so on and so forth. And how all this period was reflected at local level in Baia Mare. We could describe this through this case of this area that I was talking about, which was named Hot One in the 50s and 60s. And Hot One was a marginalized Roma area inhabited by semi-nomad Roma who were brick makers. And we could see in the archive materials that in the 1950s, they were perceived as a social problem, right? That they wanted to solve, the local authorities, right? In 1960s, this changed a bit because there was this preoccupation of local authorities to systematize the city. So started to introduce regulation of constructions, urbanistic regulations, and then the Hot One as a Roma inhabited territory was perceived as a legal issue. And that's how Roma became somehow illegal inhabitants of the city, right? Because they lived in these homes without papers. Okay, so how this story continued? It continued in the 1970s in the context when the city, the industrialization of the city strengthened. And in parallel with that, it was the aim of the state and local authorities at that time to provide housing for workers who came from rural areas to work in the new industries or old industries renewed. Right, and then so this development needed more land, and in the 1970s, middle of 1970s, Hot One was depicted as one of the lands in urban lands, territories, where they made a plan for the construction of blocks of flats, several blocks of flats, thousands of apartments, right, to be distributed to all workers. And then they started to demolish, and they demolished Hot One. And yeah, the question is how far this was a manifestation of racism to get rid of the traditional Roma population and its traditional crafts, and how far was part of this so-called regular urbanistic plan and housing development across the country. But those Roma whose houses were demolished were actually given an apartment in these new blocks of flats. At the end of the 1970s, the new district was called once Cărămidarilor, Lord Brickmakers District, and later Vasile Alexandru District, which is its name nowadays too. If you go to Baia Mare, you can look for it. And nowadays it still includes the former socialist blocks of flats and a large informal Roma settlement called Craica. Okay, so what happened at the end of the 1970s? It happened that a few Roma families couldn't pay their rent and utilities in these new apartments. So the question is why, right? Maybe they were having problems with their employment and so could not pay regularly these costs. And they were evicted from those apartments. So some evictions happened by then too, in the 1970s and 1980s, but they were not left homeless. So the local authorities in the 1980s constructed a new district in the city, with what on another margin of the city, also part of the industrial area, Arieshuri Street, whatever. So, and that, there were like, I don't know, 4 blocks there, kind of separated from the rest of the city, not worse than the other apartments, but they did not have central heating. So this was the way by which the authorities, sought to solve this problem, that people cannot pay for central heating, so we will not provide central heating. Okay, and in the 1980s, these blocks actually functioned also as a terminus point for other people who were evicted from other areas of the city. Okay, so from this analysis regarding Roma and housing in Baia Mare and how they were, conceived through their ethnicity, we concluded that the state socialist rearrangements of the whole society and economy actually couldn't really handle successfully the racialized inequalities which were inherited from the past, because actually, we came, so we have to go also beyond what happened before 1945 with the Roma population in Romania. So there was a lot of racialized inequalities inherited from the past, and institutional racism and everyday racism. But we concluded that the manifestation of Roma racialization was not systemic. So the system did not need it to function, and this is the difference between those times and the period that came after 1990 with the capitalist transformations of the country, when Roma racialization became actually a systemic feature of the system, and why, as also Angela presented priorly, because the way in which a capitalist economy functions produces surplus population. And Roma are a category of this surplus population that the system doesn't need, and if it doesn't need, well, racialization is a way to justify why it does not need them and why this category shouldn't be provided, as you said, with services of different kinds, access to housing, and they are kind of defined as unhousable in proper, adequate housing. So Roma racialization is a systemic feature of capitalism. We said a system that is relying on racialized labor force. Just to illustrate, I don't know how much time, 1 minute.
Take your time, yeah.
Yeah. So just to illustrate this conclusion about how Roma racialization is part of capitalism as system, to illustrate, go back again to the story with our area. What happened in beginning with 1990s. So there were there was this large housing privatization in the country, mostly through the right to buy policies. So obviously Roma also could buy, who could afford their apartments. But it happened that 2 blocks in that area that we watched closely those apartments were not sold. And ended up in being a very, very bad conditions, and the authorities disconnected these 2 blocks from utilities. And for 10 years or so, the city hall tolerated people living there informally, without utilities, without proper conditions, right? So there were these 2 blocks of flats. And what happened with them starting with 2010, the city hall, I don't know, got some funds to renovate these blocks. And to renovate these blocks, evicted the Roma people who lived there. So they told them that this is going to be a temporary situation, which actually became permanent, because those who were evicted from there never were allowed to return. These blocks of flats were renovated and were distributed among Romanian and Hungarian, many of them Hungarians, many of them even employees at the city hall, so city hall workers. Also as a policy, the city hall decided to give these 2 blocks of flats under the administration of the so-called heritage department of the city hall. And they named it state-owned housing, because former state-owned housing. Why? Because it was state-owned priorly, right? So they kept this name for defining these blocks. In parallel with this, the city hall renovated 2-3 other blocks of flats near Cuprom. Mara was talking about that factory, which made acid sulfuric at times, and also, copper and gold. And so it was a very important factory in the city. And it had some workers' dormitories nearby. And those workers' dormitories were actually renovated by the city hall, and they named that social housing blocks. And those social housing blocks were distributed only among Roma, and it was given under the administration of the social work department, considering that Roma are the beneficiaries of social services, so they should have their separate housing units and separate administration. So, in parallel with that, like 3 big informal settlements still exist in Baia Mare. And there is this policy, the city has different policies with these social housing blocks than the other state-owned housing blocks. Here people has to renew their contracts by in each half a year. In the other place they need to do that in 5 years or so. Okay, so so this is the story of the area, and this was our method, right, to describe it as a as a mirror through which you can zoom out towards larger urban politics and housing politics, which involved also Roma racialization in different ways, as we saw in different political economy regimes. Thank you.
Thank you, Enikő. And now we still have time for comments and questions from the room or online. So please just raise your hand either in the room or online if you want to ask a question, make a comment, suggestion. Please, Tyler.
I just had a question about kind of like Angela's chapter and the theory in it, and then how it relates to the earlier chapter that you just talked about. And I specifically wanted to kind of like highlight Gans here, because I think it's interesting that Gans is arguing for like a functional use of poverty. But when you were talking about state socialism, you were saying that this function, like all the functions he's talking about, don't seem to apply. So the system didn't, like you said, didn't need them. And I was wondering if there were a surplus population like you were describing, like what type of non-formal roles, like societal roles, were the Roma in this context filling? Like, were they filling like what we would call like black market roles, or were they filling like non-formal employment, like serving just small scale things like, I don't know, like.
You mean before 1990?
Correct, yeah. And so I guess I was just wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on how, because usually I think about something being systemic, that even if they don't need them, the system needs to not need them, so to speak. So I was wondering if you could kind of highlight how that, because I understand in a capitalist system that makes sense, but in the state socialist system, I'm not so clear on.
Maybe just being a teacher, sorry, but maybe I think it would be really important just to refresh our mind. What was this kind of, like as a positive functions of the poverty, Herbert Gans, and basically what he told us first: poor people do the dirty, dangerous, manual, and undignified work that other people do not want to do, right? We need them. So it's really, really important to have them. Second, programs that help poor people provide many jobs for the people employed by the program. You know it from all kinds of new developmental projects, right? And the third one, poor people purchase goods such as day-old bread and used clothing that other people do not wish to purchase, and those extend the economic value of these goods. It's really important, right, in our economy. And the fourth one, poverty helps to maintain the status of non-poor people. So we need them in order to, define our good status. And of course, we need them psychologically as well to distinguish ourselves from the very poor. So,
good. Yeah. Back to these examples in Myanmar. We could say maybe that theoretically the system and this rapid industrialization needed everybody as labor force, right? So needed like everybody in formal employment, but still did not happen. And when we met people who live today in this informal settlement or these social housing flats, some were people who were employed during socialist time and became unemployed and never recovered, actually, had an apartment but never could buy, and they were evicted, or people who were not formally employed, So what did these people do? For example, they were brick makers. So in this area, which was by the authorities called brick makers area at a point in the 70s. And they lived in the block, and they were allowed to use an area nearby, which now is Craica, actually, with the Roma informal settlement. This is a story told by one of the interviewees, an older woman, to use that area for brick making. So they did that and went across the city and across the country to villages and sold the bricks, right? So that was their source of income, and it was a very useful economic activity until there was a need for these bricks, right? And then, there were also others, and in this, usually we suppose that there were no, private entrepreneurial initiatives during socialism, but we met people who shared with us that they actually had some permits to do some works like in transport, using horses. Carts, right? And providing transport with materials. And they were allowed to travel within the city during 50s, 60s, until the socialist urbanization became more strict about, the use of carts and horses in the city. So therefore, for example, in these blocks, when people were evicted, there were stories about, keeping horses in the block and pinpointing them that they, actually are not civilized people and are not suitable for making a living in the blocks. So, and that was due to this discrepancy between their actual labor and the new housing arrangement that they were provided.
Take an online question from David.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, can you hear me? Unfortunately, I couldn't hear you from the panel. I just heard very well and seen the panelists when they spoke at the mic where they did their presentation. And from there, we can hear them very well, but from the panel, almost not hearable. I just want to comment. I want to congratulate the team of research, especially the points of view and the chapters that I heard more about now. I mean, Enikő Vincze and also Angéla Kóczé. Excellent chapters and excellent research. This study case actually on Baia Mare. I just wanted to comment something. Actually, the poverty of Roma is a result of cultural deficiency, but not of the Roma cultural deficiency, but a cultural deficiency of the society, of the non-Roma society that is not prepared at all for diversity, is even less and less prepared for diversity and for understanding the others, the other cultures. And that is why Roma are blamed for different things and racialized, and the poverty of Roma is actually a racial poverty. And we should underline all the time the cause of this poverty, which is actually racism. And we should bring into discussion sometimes the transitional justice, because transitional justice and reparative law can be useful when explaining, as in the book was also explained, the history and the influence of the history upon marginalization and poverty of Roma today. So everything comes from poverty, including the lack of trust in themselves of our Roma, the self-esteem that is low, and everything comes from this. And then poverty becomes a vicious circle because of the deficiency of the society. And this is called racism, and this is called what we need to do to repair and to compensate and to bring reparations and to bring equity, not equality, equity in the society, because equality is not enough. This is just a word. Equity means, as you know very well, that you bring some group that were persecuted and was destroyed during time to bring it to a level of equality with the majority group. So what we need is, what, as I said, transitional justice and reparative law and everything that comes from memory. Memory should be brought in present. And culture actually is very important, and culture is important for the whole society to understand the otherness. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Livia. Comments, questions in the room or online? If not, then thank you so much for all the panelists, the authors, editor. Thank you for coming here. Thank you for writing this beautiful book, which is available online for free, but you can also buy a copy if you want. So thank you again, and we can continue with those of you in Vienna informally outside. Thank you so much.